The one question is, where is that second stimulus package that everyone's been talking about, but we haven't seen so far? What's taking so long?
It should be coming anytime soon.
Given the fact that every sector and every company is seeking government's help, can you give us a sense of how you see the government's priorities while you work out what can be done and what cannot be done?
So in order to understand the priorities in terms of the stimulus package, Rahul, I think we also have to understand what is the basic impact of the pandemic. Firstly, it's a demand side shock because if you look at households may not consume those items that are actually discretionary. For instance, if somebody was thinking of buying a car or maybe investing in a house, they'd actually think twice before they make that decision. Similarly, companies may also think about actually holding back their investments. So there is actually a demand side shock, especially on the discretionary items, and there are impacts on the investment side. On the supply side, if you think about it, it's primarily manifests when you have firms that may run into difficulties on their cash flows. That's where the supply side impact would be. Therefore, the government's response is primarily focused on ensuring that the demand side aspects are taken care of, and that's where the first part of the package was focused on vulnerable sections for whom the marginal income actually makes a big difference in terms of how they consume, and that's what it was focused on. And the second part now is focused on the economy, especially on some of the supply side aspects.
Okay, let's deal with stimulating demand. You acknowledge, as it is absolutely correct, that reviving demand is crucial. How do you hope to go about doing that, sir?
Already, as I said, the government has initiated direct benefit transfers. And Rahul, here we have to keep in mind the enormous benefit that has accrued to the Indian economy from the JAM infrastructure, the JAM Trinity, that has enabled money to reach the accounts of the vulnerable sections through just a click. Just to give you a contrast in terms of what might have been, given the requirement for social distancing, if you look at the United States, the most advanced country in the world and possibly the best technology, etc., they're mailing checks to people. And they have to print those checks. They actually have to mail the checks to the postal department. The check reaches the person. The kind of difficulties that would have been created in the context of social distancing.
No, so what you're saying is correct, Dr. Subramanian, but when you compare the size of the stimulus, okay, go on.
Let me finish that point. So you can therefore think about how enabling the Jan Dhan accounts has really helped in reaching the money to the most vulnerable sections. And as I said earlier as well, that's where the demand aspect is most crucial. What we economists call the marginal propensity to consume is the highest in these vulnerable sections where direct benefit transfers have already reached.
Sure. So we've done direct benefit transfers, and that's very useful. However, if you compare the quantum of the help the government has provided so far as a percentage of the GDP with some of the other countries that are badly impacted by the coronavirus, and contrast this with the stringency of the lockdown, India has had the most stringent lockdown according to a study done at Oxford University, and in comparison, the Economist Intelligence Unit shows that we've had a very, very measly stimulus.
So Rahul, here, independent of whoever brings out these numbers, we have to examine them carefully. And I must tell you, and I'll use an example from the UK stimulus package. If you look at the numbers that the Economic Intelligence Unit put out, or even Oxford University, it seems as if they're actually given a stimulus of 15% of GDP. But a key aspect of that includes 350 billion pounds of loans, which are guaranteed by the government, and those have been directly added. Now, you will recognize, and all our viewers will also recognize, that the actual cost of that package is a fraction of that 350 billion pounds. When you do the numbers correctly, it comes to 3.7% of GDP. Similarly, if you look at the United States as well, it is not 10% of GDP, it's about 6.5 to 6.6% of GDP. So firstly, we have to use the correct numbers to evaluate, and as I said, there is another package that is actually being worked on. So when you will compare, or all the viewers should compare, they can compare after the second package is also there. But when they do, they must keep the numbers, actually make sure they're not adding apples and oranges. Second, it's very important to keep in mind the differences that prevail between India and other economies. If you take the tax to GDP ratio of the US, or let's say the United Kingdom, and compare that to India, they are very, very different. And as we all know, money does not grow on trees. If your tax to GDP ratio is lower, you are constrained, and that is something you have to keep in mind. Third point, which is very important, is if you look within the category of countries which have the sovereign rating that India has, the amount is far, far lower than even these corrected numbers. And that's also something that we have to keep in mind. So it is really crucial to keep these differences in mind when we think about actually the stimulus that is possible and what the stimulus that will be actually given.
So the government does have very serious revenue considerations, and there is no doubt about it. So I'd like to ask you, how do you hope to finance the second stimulus? What are the kind of ideas that you are working around with? How do you hope to find the money, given the fact that industrial activity has crashed, GST collections are down terribly? How do you hope to finance the stimulus?
So that's a good question. First, I have to make two important observations on this. Firstly, if we think about the fiscal deficit, the reason we as economists or any other analyst think about the fiscal deficit, it has to be in a dynamic sense, and that's because we worry about, or we care about, the debt to GDP, overall debt to GDP of the country, and not just in a static sense, but in a dynamic sense. And one of the key aspects that macroeconomics actually teaches us is that debt sustainability depends on what we economists think about as this difference between the rate at which you borrow and the rate of nominal rate of growth of the economy. And our analysis has shown that even with 4% real growth from next year onwards, I'm talking about FY22, because FY21 actually will be lower, even with 4% plus growth, for next 5 to 10 years, debt will come down because the nominal GDP will be higher than the cost of borrowing. So that's point number one. Secondly, when we focus on the borrowing that has to be done this year, we possibly were prescient, in opening up the market for government borrowings via, the bond index, enlisting the Indian government bonds in the bond index. Just to give you some important numbers, about $4 trillion of money tracks these bond indices. India is expected to get a weight of around 1.5 to 3%. That translates, even if you take the lower number, 1.5%, that translates into $60 billion, which is about the gross borrowing that India does. Now, I recognize that this money may not come immediately, but will come actually maybe latter half of the year or next year. But that gives you the opportunity then to structure your borrowing in such a way, in terms of the maturity, etc., to be able to finance the deficit and also do it in a way that the cost of borrowing does not become very large.
There are lots